Walking tree stump. British actor John Pertwee had a strange encounter in his childhood. As a small boy, John was staying over at a friend's house, an Elizabethan home in Sussex. John was asked if he was comfortable sleeping in a certain bedroom, since all the other rooms were occupied during the holiday season. He recalled his friend's father asking whether that was wise, to which the mother replied that it was fine, because John was a deep sleeper. On the first night in the room, he woke up feeling awfully nauseous and vomited over the bed sheets. Embarrassed, he cleaned the sheets with water and hung them up to dry. The following night, he discovered what had caused his sickness. He went to bed again, and just like the previous night, he awoke suddenly. The room was filled with the most overpowering smell of rotting flesh, exactly like that of a dead sheep. John felt violently sick and shot upright in the bed. About 4 feet from the edge of the mattress was a thing he described as a tree stump with a light greenish color. The stump-like object had bubbles forming on its side that didn't burst, but instead simply disappeared. The thing began slowly moving toward him. Terrified, John wet the bed and immediately rushed across the house to his friend's parents. As the mother comforted him, he heard her husband say that they shouldn't have put him in the room. When John later asked his friend about what he had seen, he was told that others had encountered it as well. That was why the family never placed guests in that room. But since they believed John was a deep sleeper, they assumed he wouldn't be awakened by the thing. He never did find out what the creature actually was. Alien pancakes. At 11 a.m. on April 18, 1961, Joe Simonton was having breakfast on his farm when he heard a commotion outside. He went into the yard and saw a flying saucer drop out of the sky, hover over his backyard, and then land. The hatch of the saucer opened, revealing 3 aliens, each about 5 feet tall and weighing roughly 125 pounds, whom Joe described as Italian-looking. They appeared to be between 25 and 30 years old and wore dark blue knit uniforms with turtleneck tops and helmet-like caps. The aliens did not speak in Joe's presence, but they pulled up a jug with silvery handles and gestured for water, handing the container to him. Joe went into his basement, filled the jug, and brought it back to them. Looking inside the saucer, he saw one of the aliens cooking what appeared to be pancakes on a flameless cooking appliance. In return for the water, one of the aliens presented Joe with 3 pancakes straight from the grill. As he did so, the alien touched his forehead in what seemed to be a salute of thanks. Joe saluted back, and the aliens then departed in their flying saucer. Joe later tried one of the pancakes, which he described as tasting like cardboard. He gave the remaining 2 pancakes to Vilas County Judge Frank Carter, a local UFO enthusiast. Help me, Susie's dying. Around 1975, Rob Dixon and a few other kids insisted on gathering at the nearest phone box to hear a spooky message. By dialing a random number, without needing to insert any coins, they could hear a woman speaking in a monotone voice, repeating, help me, Susie's dying." Some of the kids said that occasionally, the message would change to, help me, Susie's drowning." Other children in the Lancashire, England area also reported hearing the same message, but no one could explain its origin or nature. Wollaton Park Gnomes. One evening, in late September 1979, a group of children were playing in Wollaton Park in Nottingham. It was around 8:30 p.m. when one of the children noticed something in a fenced-off area of the park that they called the swamps. Emerging from a small hole in the fence was a little man. When the children tried to get closer, he retreated back inside. A few of the children then went after him. As they did, they heard the sound of bells and saw a group of little men emerge from the tops of the trees and bushes in what they described as small red and white bubble cars. The little men, referred to by the children as gnomes, were about half the size of the kids. They had wrinkled faces, long white beards with red tips, and wore old-fashioned nightcaps, blue tops, and yellow tights. There were about 60 of these gnomes, with 2 riding in each of the little red cars. The cars had strange triangular headlights and no steering wheels. Instead, they had what the children described as a round device with a handle to turn. The gnomes began playfully chasing the children around the park, laughing as they did. At one point, one of the children fell headfirst into the swamp while being pursued. Frightened, the children tried to escape from the cars, which they said moved as fast as a normal car. The gnomes seemed to be enjoying themselves, chasing the kids for about 15 minutes, before the children finally managed to escape out onto the street. The gnomes refused to follow the children and remained within the park. Later, the children reported the encounter to their school teachers. No wife, no fire. One day, in the year 2000, Ronald Rosenblatt was alone in his Zurich apartment with his cat, Polly, when the telephone rang. When he answered, an unfamiliar voice told him that his wife had just called to report a fire in his oven. Ronald replied that he had no wife, and there was no fire in his oven. Shortly after hanging up, he heard a knock on his door. Standing there were two white men in their 30s, dressed in plain clothes and offering no identification. They claimed they were from building security, although Ronald knew that all the building security guards wore uniforms. One of the men, who was calm, repeated that Ronald's wife had called to report a fire in his oven. Once again, Ronald explained that he had neither a wife nor a fire. The other man, however, seemed to be in a violent rage, shouting that he was going to enter the apartment no matter what. Suddenly, Polly the cat jumped up onto a chair, clearly visible from the doorway. This seemed to have an effect on the calm man, who quickly grabbed his partner as they both turned and left. A few moments later, an actual security guard, this one in full uniform with a badge, arrived. He told Ronald the same thing the other two men had said, and once again, Ronald denied having a wife or a fire. Brown Mantic cures addiction. An anonymous man reported a strange encounter in 2019. He was staying at a Hilton hotel in Goose Creek, South Carolina, where he was working in the data center industry. For years he had been battling addiction, and no matter how much money he earned or how successful he became, he repeatedly relapsed, even after long periods of sobriety. One night, after watching a documentary about various gods, he memorized their names and prayed to each of them to release him from the burden of addiction. He then went straight to bed. Shortly after falling asleep, he was awakened by a large, brown, mantis-like being standing to the right of his bed. The creature was as tall as the ceiling and appeared to be standing within a kind of portal or opening in the hotel room wall. The man found himself paralyzed. Only his eyes could move. He was then lifted about 3 feet above the bed and became increasingly terrified, at which point the creature reassured him that it was there to help. The experience lasted roughly 3 to 5 minutes before he was lowered back onto the bed. When he woke up, he could move normally. The being was gone, and the wall had returned to normal. What had changed, according to the man, was that he no longer suffered from addiction or cravings. He says he often prays for the being to return, so he can thank it for changing his life.
Well,
bulls dancing on hind legs.
I don't know, if I see something scary like
During
that...
the summer of 1984,
I'm good.
Scott, who was about 9, was staying at his grandparents' house in the countryside. He was lying on the couch, staring out the window and waiting for his grandpa to arrive home from work. It was getting late, and his grandma was getting worried, since a dense fog had begun to form and was growing thicker by the minute. Outside the window, Scott saw 2 lights coming up the road toward the house. At first, he thought they were headlights from his grandpa's car, but as they moved closer, he realized they weren't. One light was a lemon yellow, while the other was pink. Scott quickly rushed to the kitchen to get his grandmother. They both looked out the window, seeing that the lights were now closer than before. They had begun to take on a more definite shape, as if something was emerging from the fog. When Scott asked his grandma about the lights, she had no idea what they were, but she seemed frightened by the sight. The lights were almost at the house by this point, and were taking on a more tangible shape. Scott described what they saw as 2 bulls dancing along the road on their hind legs, one glowing yellow and the other glowing pink. Each bull had a front leg, or arm, draped over the shoulder of the other as they danced toward the driveway. By that point, his grandma had fainted on the couch. Scott quickly glanced at her to make sure she was okay, before returning to the window. The bulls were now making their way toward the house, before suddenly vanishing. A minute or so after they disappeared, Scott tried shaking his grandma awake, and after a couple of minutes, she began regaining consciousness. She turned quickly to the window, but Scott told her that whatever they had seen was gone. Scott asked his grandma about what they'd witnessed, but she had no answer. She did, however, ask him not to tell Grandpa about it.
Yeah, hell no.
A few minutes later, Grandpa arrived home, and Scott rushed up to him, explaining what they had seen. Grandpa proceeded to grab his shotgun and head outside.
What you looking at? Oh, I hate when he does that. It's me! He's watching my other monitor, and he's like freaking out. He sees a cat. It's me! Let me see. It's me, Papash. Hey, that's not. It's a screen.
Returning several minutes later after finding nothing. After this, both Grandma and Grandpa never spoke of what happened that evening again. A few years later, one of Scott's friends described an encounter she had with these dancing bulls, an experience almost identical to Scott's, despite the fact that he had never told her about his own. Scott then shared his story with her, but after that, he never saw the bulls again. Flat 2D cats. Chris and his wife Jackie were moving into their current home when they saw a black cat watching them from the hallway.
He's seeing the cat.
What was unusual?
He's seeing the cat on the screen and he's freaking out. He's trying to...
According to Chris, was the way it seemed separate from its surroundings. He described it as looking like a cutout picture of a cat, with no regard for lighting or shadows. Chris watched the cat for a moment, before it vanished. Since Chris and Jackie owned cats, one of the first things they did was install a cat flap in the back door.
Your dog does
the previous owners hadn't owned any cats, so Chris was surprised to find that a hole for a cat flap had already been cut into the door and then boarded over. He was even more surprised to find clumps of old black fur caught around the edges. Since then, both he and Jackie have seen the cat wandering the house frequently.
Hell no.
Tar Baby. At around 1:30 a.m., sometime in August of 1961, Miss Quinn abruptly woke up in her bed to find what she described as a terrible-looking creature hovering beside her bed. She watched in horror as the creature drifted across her bedroom toward the bed where her daughters were sleeping. It was then when her 14-year-old daughter Judy awoke to see this creature hanging above her head. Judy described the being as looking like a huge tar baby with enormous eyes. After a few moments, the thing seemingly vanished.
Why do they always vanish, bro?
Greenwater talking bear. On the morning of July 6, 1985, a pair of campers contacted the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, complaining that they had been forced out of their campsite. According to one of the campers, Stephanie McKay, it was dawn when a bear attacked their tent. The bear then began talking to them, asking their names and whether they had permission to use the campsite. They replied that they did have permission. However, the bear told them to leave the property immediately. Both campers were in shock and quickly packed their belongings. Stephanie claimed that the bear was 8 feet tall, stood up on its hind legs, and began hurling rocks at them as they left. Officers from the Greenwater Fire Department later investigated the site, but found no signs of the bear. Deputy Sheriff Bob Hoffman concluded that the report was unfounded and probably the result of an overactive imagination.
Who's that?
If it looks at you, you'll die.
In
1914, 6-year-old Eileen Ganley lived with her family on Spike Island, where her father was serving in the British Army. Every day, at 12 p.m., Eileen would fetch the newspaper for her father, which came over from the seaport town of Cove. She would walk along a road that skirted the sea and pass by a doctor's house, surrounded by a 5-foot-high wall. One day, as she walked, absorbed in her thoughts, and looking down at the ground, she happened to look up. Just as she was about 5 yards away from the corner of the wall, something seemed to be looking over the wall across toward Cove. She continued walking a few more steps before becoming frozen in place with fear. She could now see the thing clearly. The creature was very tall. Its waist reached the top of the wall. Eileen described it as roughly human, with a head, shoulders, and arms, though its hands were hidden behind the wall.
But
it had 2 holes in
once
place
I saw
of eyes,
a bear
and
in
its
real
skin
life,
was a
I
glistening yellow.
I can't
Very
believe that I
slowly,
actually have
the thing turned its head
phobia
to
of
look
it.
toward Eileen. At that moment, she heard a voice in her ear say, "If it looks straight at you, Eileen, you will die." Petrified, she somehow managed to turn and run, eventually stumbling into her neighbor Mrs. Riley's cottage. She told her what she had seen, and Mrs. Riley replied, "You're not the first, nor will you be the last to see that." Although Eileen never saw the creature again, she later learned that it was common knowledge that the doctor's garden was haunted. Man in the cupboard. When Andrew was 11, he had a fitted wardrobe positioned diagonally opposite his bed, which he would usually leave open. One morning, as he lay lazily in bed, Andrew saw what appeared to be a man inside the wardrobe. The figure was in black and white, and appeared fuzzy, almost like a poor quality television image, while the surroundings remained in color. The man was wearing Bermuda shorts, a t-shirt, shades, and a baseball cap. After a few seconds of being observed, the man reached one hand to touch the top of his hat, and then vanished from the feet up in a single, quick movement. Andrew got up and looked into the wardrobe, but found nothing inside. Space Brains. At around 2 a.m. on August 17, 1971, Peter Rodriguez and John Hodges left the home of a mutual friend. The pair got into John's car, and just as they were about to drive off, they noticed two huge, disembodied brains lying about 6 feet in front of them in the middle of the road. They later described the brains as bluish in color and surrounded by a strange vapor. One of the creatures was approximately the size of an overgrown softball, while the second was about the size of a human torso and appeared to have a red, eye-like organ wedged into the center of his frontal lobe.
No.
Both men were frightened by the sight and quickly sped away. Since their friend lived nearby, the drive should have taken only a few minutes. John dropped Peter off and then went straight home. However, upon arriving at his house, he noticed that 2 hours had passed, even though the trip should not have taken longer than 10 minutes.
Oh, hell no.
John had apparently experienced a bout of missing time, with no recollection of what happened during those 2 hours. In 1976, 5 years after the encounter, John decided to undergo hypnotic regression to determine what had happened during the missing time. Under hypnosis, he recounted that upon arriving home, the same two large blue brains were waiting outside for him. He then seemed to lose consciousness, as his next memory was of waking up in what he described as a control room. There, he was greeted by a group of bald, thin-lipped, 7-foot-tall gray-skinned humanoids with 6 webbed fingers and toes. They explained that the brains he had seen were organic translation devices used to facilitate telepathic communication with humans. The beings then warned that humanity must learn to control its dangerous power or face destruction. Following this warning, John felt a buzzing sensation and then opened his eyes to find himself back in his car. Although he never saw the beings again, John claimed to have received telepathic messages from them, in which they predicted that in 1983, a war would break out in the Middle East and spread to Europe, after which they would formally establish contact with humanity. None of these predictions ever came to pass, though.
I mean, no.
Walking skeletons on top of a train car.
About their
On the paranormal subreddit, user Lovely Bloom recounted a strange experience they had when they were around 6 or 7 years old. Opie and their family had just moved to a ranch house in Laredo, Texas, in a rural area where many low-income families lived. Their neighbors were a family of 6 little girls and 2 adults. The family often didn't have much to eat, so Opie's mother would frequently help them out with food, and in return, the girls would help clean Opie's house. One day, the family came over for dinner and stayed to help clean before heading home. Opie and the neighbor's youngest girl fell asleep on the bed, but were woken by Opie's mother since it had gotten late. Opie decided to walk the girl home along the dirt road that connected both houses. Just as Opie was returning after dropping her off, they heard the girl running back toward them, screaming. When Opie asked what was wrong, the girl pointed to the top of some abandoned train cars and shouted, "Look!" There, on top of the train cars, were 3 skeletons walking back and forth. One was lying down, wearing a tank top and shorts, while the other 2 were waving hello at Opie and the girl. Terrified, Opie rushed back home and told their mother and 2 brothers what they had seen. Surprisingly, when they all returned to look, the skeletons were still there, still waving. They threw rocks at the figures, but the rocks seemed to pass right through them. After a while, Opie and their family returned home, and they never saw the skeletons again. Years later, when Opie was older, they asked their mother if she remembered the encounter. She did. She also claimed that the reason the little girl had been so frightened was because the skeletons apparently wouldn't let her go back to her house.
What?
Granola people. On the Humanoid Encounters subreddit, a user asked whether anyone had ever encountered
How come we can never find
granola-like people.
footage of any of these experiences?
Now 20,
and when
claimed
they
to have
do,
encountered 2 such granola-textured
and when
beings.
there is video footages, the fucking people are recording with the toaster. Maybe stuff like this doesn't happen to me because I bring out my camera all the time.
Over the years, his first experience occurred when he was 5. He would wake up in the middle of the night and see 2 beings, each about 3 feet 2 inches tall, with yellow eyes and skin textured like granola.
That's what fucking bit my toe.
Staring at him. Whenever this happened, he would either squeeze his eyes shut or turn the other way. Despite telling his parents about these encounters countless times, they dismissed them as the product of a child's overactive imagination. One morning, however, after an encounter the previous night, 2 sets of tiny handprints appeared on his bedside. They weren't normal handprints, but rather impressions of fingerless hands made of a foul-smelling, granola-textured substance. OP's parents were baffled, but ultimately wrote it off as him having a midnight snack. The encounters continued throughout the 3 years OP lived in Kansas, and even after moving to other states, he continued to see the beings well into his teenage years. Man tries to fight an alien. Celio Lima Batista was on his way home late one night, walking along a desolate field, when he noticed some lights and figures behind him. Thinking he was about to be robbed, he turned around to confront whoever was following him, and was faced with a huge, 2-meter-tall figure with large fiery eyes, a massive head, and pincer-like hands. He lunged at the creature and swung several times, but all his attacks seemed to miss. Exhausted, he stepped back, stunned. Suddenly, the enormous creature lunged at him, beating him senseless. Celio was later found unconscious and taken to a nearby hospital, where several large bruises were discovered on his back, and he was treated for a wound on one of his fingers. Neanderthal on a stick. In 2012, Alexander O was gathering mushrooms in a forest near the city of Vitebsk in Belarus. After driving to the area, he left the car while his wife walked toward the lake. Looking around, he didn't find many mushrooms, so he began calling his wife's name, but she didn't answer. He continued collecting the few mushrooms that were there, and called out to her again. As Alexander looked up, he noticed what appeared to be a piece of burnt wood, thin and black. Assuming it was a charred tree, he paid little attention and kept walking, but the tree remained in place, and he suddenly felt a strange urge to take a closer look. When he raised his eyes higher, he saw a head, 3 times larger than his own. It resembled a monkey's head, with a low forehead and large eyes. The head seemed to be 3 or 4 meters above the ground, staring directly at Alexander. Despite its massive size, the expression on its face was pleasant rather than threatening, and Alexander surprisingly felt no fear. The face had overgrown black hair, dark skin, and human-like lips and a nose. Strangely, Alexander could not see a torso, nor any arms or legs. The being appeared intelligent, which made him want to speak to it. Yet, in an instant, it vanished. After a while, his wife returned. Reflecting on what he had seen, Alexander estimated the creature to be about 3 meters tall. What he assumed was that the tree was actually its torso, which was extremely thin. He remained certain that he had not seen any limbs at all. Cockroach asks for bed sheets. In the late 1990s, Peggy decided to settle down for the night in a motel in California City during a long drive from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. While watching TV in the motel room, she heard a knock on the door. She approached it and opened it without unhooking the chain. She heard a man's voice asking for some bed sheets, but at first, she couldn't see anyone. As she continued looking around for the source of the voice, she discovered that it didn't belong to a human at all, but instead to an enormous cockroach. The creature stood upright and was roughly 6.5 feet tall.
I'm listening.
It didn't take long for the creature to notice Peggy watching it from behind the door. When it did, it spat a brown substance toward her. Peggy screamed, which prompted the creature to utter the word, "Why?" She didn't respond. Instead, she opened the door, dashed past the creature and ran down the corridor. The creature followed closely behind and grabbed onto her cotton dress just as she neared the exit. It wrapped its double-barbed hands around her wrists, and its chitinous antenna brushed against her face. Terrified and on the verge of losing consciousness, Peggy fought back, kicking the creature's ankles out from under it before kicking it in the face. She took off running again. The creature quickly got back up and continued chasing her. Peggy reached the door at the end of the corridor and slammed it shut on the creature's antenna, causing it to emit a high-pitched shriek. As she rushed out of the hotel, she ran into a man at a payphone who had witnessed the giant cockroach pursuing her and had called the police. Almost immediately, 2 police cars arrived at the scene, prompting the creature to flee. Flying arrow. In 1960 or 1961, 11-year-old Ruth Summersides was home alone painting when she heard a kind of whistling and whooshing sound behind her. Turning around, she saw something flying toward her and quickly threw herself to the ground as the object passed over her head. When she stood up, she saw an arrow that had flown across the yard and struck the front door, sticking nose first into it. Ruth went to investigate, and as she got closer, she saw that the arrow had set out vertically beneath the door knocker. It was around 6 inches long, with a black pointed head and a frilly ruff around the short neck section. Hanging from its neck were about 6 shiny red ribbon-like streamers with similar black streamers beneath them. To Ruth's surprise, the thing began moving, whirling and spinning, while making the same whistling sound she had heard before. She immediately ran toward the back of the house, with the object still whistling behind her and seemingly following her. She hid in the pantry until her parents came home, though they didn't believe her story, insisting she had probably seen a dragonfly or a hornet. One day, while delivering eggs to an old man in the village, Ruth told him about the encounter. He replied that it had been 50 years since he had last seen one of those things, which he called flying arrows. Attempted abduction by a lobster thing. Sherry grew up in a remote area of Greene County, Pennsylvania, that was known for unexplained and paranormal phenomena. When Sherry was 14, she had an unusual experience that might have been a botched alien abduction. She woke up to find herself dangling by one arm in the claw of a huge creature that resembled a crayfish or lobster. It was about 7 to 8 feet tall and had enormous antennae. The creature was positioned in the window, whose glass was missing, and had been replaced by a strangely lit doorway.
Larry the lobster.
It attempted to pull her through this doorway, but she struggled against it until it dropped her to the floor. The next morning, Sherry awoke lying on her side on the floor, her shoulder aching wildly, and a huge black bruise on her arm where the creature had held her. At first, she believed she had dreamt the experience, but she couldn't explain how she ended up on the floor or the visible bruises. Whatever the entity's purpose was, it didn't return again. Asparagus aliens cure cancer.
What?
In July 1951, Fred Reagan, a pilot, was flying his plane over Georgia when he felt a mysterious force pull his aircraft upward, crashing it into an unknown object. Suddenly, he found himself inside a strange craft where he encountered 3 entities, roughly 3 feet tall, which he likened to giant, metallic stalks of asparagus. The creatures apologized to Fred for the accident and proceeded to give him a medical examination. They then informed him that they had cured him of cancer, which he had never known he'd had. Fred was later found unconscious in a field, seemingly unscathed, with his plane wrecked nearby and its engine buried almost 6 feet into the ground. 11 months after the encounter, Fred mysteriously died from brain deterioration, which was attributed to overexposure to atomic radiation. Aliens have a barbecue. 4 men were digging in a turquoise vein in the desert near Kelvin, Arizona, when they noticed what appeared to be the desert floor moving across the sky. Suddenly, an object that had been camouflaged appeared from the west and stopped about a football field's length away from the witnesses before landing. A ramp extended from the object, and 2 men, dressed in shorts and t-shirts, walked down. They were followed by 2 women and 3 children. The men returned to the object and brought out something resembling a barbecue, then a table, and some chairs that appeared metallic. The women seemed to be carrying food and something resembling a cooler. One of the men approached the witnesses and asked what they were doing. The men replied that they were searching for turquoise. The visitor responded that he would never understand human fascination with rocks, and then walked away. Soon after, the group of visitors gathered up all their belongings, waved at the witnesses, and departed. Aliens tried to kidnap a dog.
No.
John Trasko was outside feeding his dog when he saw an egg-shaped object in front of
They
his
killed
barn.
him instead of helping him.
There, he found a 3-foot-tall being with a putty-colored face, wearing a green costume decorated with buttons, a Scottish bonnet, and gloves. The entity then said, in bad English, "We are peaceful people. We only want your dog." John refused, telling the being to go back where it came from.
What?
The being then returned to the craft and took off. Riri carjackers. On November 2,
Why did they
1967,
want the dog
Will
for?
and Guy were driving home after a night of drinking when a flying saucer suddenly blocked their path. The saucer's dome opened, and one of the occupants emerged and climbed into the driver's seat of their car. The being was small, with rough, scarred skin that almost resembled a cantaloupe. It proceeded to drive the car a short distance into a field before stopping.
Aliens.
Guy, who was in
Thinks
the
aliens go
passenger
to
seat,
Vegas?
immediately jumped out and ran to the nearest building to call for help, but the saucer appeared to follow him. Meanwhile, Will remained in the car, as the alien driver began chattering in an incomprehensible voice that sounded like a woman or bird. A few moments later, the being returned to the saucer, rejoined its partner, and the two took off into the night sky. Humpty Dumpty. On an Ask Reddit thread asking about the weirdest, most unexplainable experiences Redditors had witnessed, user Wally shared his own story. As a child, Wally's grandfather had taken him to an old movie theater that had an orchestra pit which hadn't been used in years. While following his grandfather through the area between the front row seats and the orchestra pit, Wally decided to peek inside. To his shock, there was no floor in the pit. Instead, he could see directly into the basement, where a large, man-sized egg lay on the floor. The egg had a happy face painted on its shell, and it even had arms and legs. It was lying on its back, flailing its limbs as if trying to stand, but unable to, due to its shape. Wally looked away at his grandfather, then back into the pit, and the egg's expression had changed. Its face now conveyed grief and frustration, with closed eyes and a grimacing mouth. Looking away a second time and then back again, the egg was gone. Only the bare basement floor remained. When he looked away once more, the orchestra pit floor had returned to its usual state, with only a small handful of wooden folding chairs scattered on it. Over the years, Wally revisited the theater multiple times and looked into the orchestra pit each time, but he never saw anything like that again, just the plain, ordinary floor of the orchestra pit. Alien Body Snatchers. In April 1972, a group of US Special Ops forces was moving through the Cambodian jungle toward the Vietnamese border to track what they believed was an enemy outpost, intercepting classified military signals. They were suddenly caught off guard by a highly reflective circular craft standing on the ground in front of them. The craft emitted a deep, humming noise that induced uneasiness and nausea among the soldiers. Several humanoid figures were moving around the craft. They had large, hairless heads and black eyes that wrapped around their faces. The beings appeared to be loading various body parts and corpses into a large, metallic, bin-like structure before sealing it. The bodies seemed to belong to both American and non-American soldiers. Witnessing this, the soldiers immediately took cover behind nearby foliage and opened fire on the aliens. Their efforts were largely ineffective, as the beings seemed to wear some sort of armor. Despite this, 3 of the aliens were killed by headshots, and another was struck down by friendly fire. During the firefight, 1 human soldier was killed, and several others were burned by a beam emitted from the craft. Due to the casualties on both sides, the aliens retreated into the craft and quickly took off. The injured soldiers were reportedly transported to a military base in Vietnam, where they were interrogated and warned not to reveal their experiences to the public.
Yo. And I said I was gonna watch half of it. Yo, that one was a good video. I'll have that saved up again. I'm gonna rewatch that one again later.